afternoon, everyone. Y'all find seats and we'll get our panel going here. Good morning. Welcome to the 5th Annual Mississippi Book Festival. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you've not done so, please silence your cell phones. This panel on the U.S. Civil War is sponsored by the Mississippi Humanities Council and Mississippi State University. One of the Book Festival's board members from Mississippi State, John Marszalek, is on this panel. Is Frances Coleman here, Dean of the Libraries? Did she make it for this? Another strong supporter, as is Stuart Rockoff, Director of the Mississippi Humanities Council. I don't believe he's in the room, but we thank them for their support. And we're in the room today, courtesy of Foreman Watkins Law Firm. Our panelists are Jacqueline Dowd Hall, Shelby Harrell, John Marszalek, and Ben Wynn. You can purchase copies of their books outdoors, and you can find the times that they'll be signing in your brochure. We'll hear from our panelists for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Please go to the podium here and ask your question into the microphone at that time. Now, help me welcome Jim Woodrick, Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer for Mississippi and the author of The Civil War Siege of Jackson, Mississippi.
Thank you, Chris. Welcome, everyone. Glad to have you today. I'd like to introduce our authors, beginning to my immediate left, Dr. Jacqueline Dowd Hall, who's an Oklahoma native. She has an undergraduate degree from what is now Rhodes College in Memphis, and both a master's and PhD from Columbia University. Among her many accomplishments, she's the founding director of the Southern Oral History Program and is the Julia Cherry Spruill Professor of History Emerita at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's the author of several books, including Like a Family, The Making of a Southern Cotton Mill World, and the topic of today's discussion, Sisters and Rebels, A Struggle for the Soul of America. Next to her is Shelby Harrell, who is a Mississippi native and a graduate of the University of Southern Mississippi with a master's degree in education. She's currently an instructor of mathematics, which scares me to death, at Pearl River Community College in Poplarville. Her ongoing research on the role of women soldiers in the Civil War has been widely published and utilized by the National Park Service and state historic sites. Earlier this year, her interest in the topic resulted in her first book, Behind the Rifle, Women Soldiers in Civil War Mississippi, published by University Press of Mississippi. Next to her is Dr. John Marszalek, a native of Buffalo, New York. He earned his PhD from University of Notre Dame. After serving in the military, he began a distinguished teaching career, and since 1973 has been on the faculty at Mississippi State University, where he is now the Giles Distinguished Professor Emeritus in History. He's the author of 15 books, but perhaps most significantly for today's discussion, since 2008, he has served as Executive Director of the Ulysses S. Grant Association's Presidential Library at Mississippi State. Dr. Marszalek is co-author of Hold On with a Bulldog Grip, a short study of Ulysses S. Grant, which we'll be discussing today. And finally, author and historian Dr. Ben Wynn is a native of Florence, Mississippi. After attending Millsaps College as an undergraduate, he earned an MA in history from Mississippi College and a doctorate from the University of Mississippi. He currently serves as professor of history at the University of North Georgia in Gainesville. He's the author of 4 books, including In Tune, Charlie Patton, Jimmie Rodgers, and Roots of American Popular Music, and the subject of today's discussion, The Man Who Punched Jefferson Davis, The Political Life of Henry Stewart Foote, published by LSU Press in 2018. And I'm going to start with Ben, if he doesn't mind too much, and ask each of you to give a brief overview of your book and what we're talking about today.
All right, thanks. I'm Ben Wynn. The book title, The Man Who Punched Jefferson Davis. It could have really been titled "The Man Who Punched," and then fill in the blank, because this guy punched a lot of guys during his career. Before we get started, I want to thank the Mississippi Book Festival for inviting me here today. I want to thank C-SPAN, of course, and I also want to, I'm a Jackson native. I want to give a shout out to St. Andrew's Episcopal School, where I attended school from grade 1 through 12, because first grade, they literally taught me to write in the most literal sense. And the foundation, the educational foundation that we all got there is very important. I discovered Henry Foote when I was back in the dark ages. I was doing my doctoral dissertation, and I was doing it on the Mississippi Unionists before the Civil War, the people that didn't want to secede, or they were more moderate as far as the secession issue, not particularly the slavery issue, but the secession issue specifically. And I started researching those types of people and their politics, and this guy Foote, his name kept popping up everywhere. And he was a U.S. Senator from Mississippi from 1847 to 1851, which was the period where you had what some people call the first secession crisis. A lot of issues that dealing with slavery had come to a head. There was a lot of back and forth in Washington, very tense time. And that era produced something called the Compromise of 1850, which postponed the Civil War for about a decade. And he was all wrapped up in that. And then he became governor of Mississippi right after that, from 1851 to 53. And what was interesting about Foote is he really went against the trend at the time, the political trend. Most of the politicians were starting to become pretty radical with regard to the slavery issue, and we're already talking about secession and so on and so forth. And Foote, at great political risk, was a pro-union politician from Mississippi during that period, and he espoused that on the floor of the U.S. Senate and won an election, defeated Jefferson Davis for governor on that platform. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So I started studying, looking for things about him. And then I found out, and I just made a short list of what he did. As a politician, this guy was wild. He was all over the place. I mean, he would go from being this very refined, he was a great writer, this statesman-like persona, to being this maniac, While during his political career, he fought in 6 duels, innumerable fistfights. While he was on the floor of the United States Senate, this is what he did there, among other things. He pulled a gun on Thomas Hart Benton, a fellow, another senator from Missouri, on the floor of the Senate. He pulled a knife on another senator on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Got in a fist fight with a fellow senator from Arkansas on the floor of the United States Senate. Got in a fight in the cloakroom with a guy named John C. Fremont, who ended up being the first Republican candidate for president. Got in a fight with him there, not on the floor of the Senate, but in the Senate cloakroom. He threatened to hang John C. Hale, another senator, from a tree. And then he got in the famous fist fight with Jefferson Davis. So I looked at all that and I said, how can I not, see what this guy was up to? But he had this very volatile career. He's born in 1806 and he died in 1880. So his public career spanned a very controversial sort of period of time. And he had this great feud with Jefferson Davis. Probably Jefferson Davis is that most outspoken critic that most people have never heard of. I mean, he ends up getting elected to the Confederate Congress, and some people believe he did that just so he could stand up on the floor of the Confederate Congress and talk about Jefferson Davis, because that's all he did, demanding investigations of Jefferson Davis, talking about Jefferson Davis, what a coward he was, and how he was screwing up the whole the war effort. I mean, over and over again. But again, he was kind of this maniacal, could be this kind of maniacal guy that led this colorful life, to say the least. And when he died, all the obituaries, people either loved him, they bought into what he was doing, or probably more people hated him because he tended to burn his bridges wherever he went. But anyway, one other thing he did while he was a politician, if all that wasn't enough, he ran for office as a Jacksonian Democrat, as a Whig, as a mainstream Democrat, as a Union Democrat, as a member of the Know Nothing Party, as a Confederate congressman, and he finally ended up joining the Republican Party after the war. So he did all of that as well. And he ended up, when he died, he had published 4 books. He published his own personal history of the Confederate war effort. Basically, he published that he lambasts all of his enemies in the book. And he also tried to broker a peace agreement with the Lincoln administration in 1865. He just left the Confederate Congress and decided to go try to do that. He was never able to talk to Lincoln. He did get as far as Seward, and he was arrested and thrown out of the country as a result. But anyway, quite an interesting character, and that's what kind of drew me to him.
John?
Okay. Well, this book, and the title, I'm holding it up for obvious reasons because I'm shilling it, but the book, Hold On with a Bulldog Grip, A Short History of Ulysses S. Grant, is important. The title's important. It's been selected by Mississippi State University this year to serve as its 2019 Maroon edition. What happens is each year, the university gives to all incoming freshmen and transfer students a gratis copy of some particular book, which is then used in a common reading project in class events and gatherings on campus, et cetera. And in fact, the whole thing starts this coming Thursday, August 22nd, in the Humphrey Coliseum, where President Mark Keenum will be talking about this book. And I might add, this is the 10th year this has been done. Now, this year's book was actually inspired by the U.S. Grant Presidential Library being housed in the Mitchell Memorial Library on campus. And I should tell you that since Grant came to Mississippi, every phone call that comes in from the media always asks the same question: how is it possible that U.S. Grant could be in the heart of Mississippi? Well, in answering the question, we normally tell a lie first, and we quote Lincoln's comment to Grant during the Virginia campaign. Remember, Grant and Lee fought each other in Virginia. And Lincoln wrote to Grant and said, "Hold on with a bulldog grip." So we like to say that even Lincoln knew that Grant was going to Mississippi. So we have a new Mississippi State Bulldog. To tell the truth, actually, what we do is we then try to tell the truth that in addition to Grant's historical connection to Mississippi, Mississippi State made the best offer of a lot of different institutions around the country to provide institutional support for this Grant Presidential Library. Now, MSU President Mark Keenum came up with the idea for this book, and when you look at the copy of the cover, you'll notice that the book has been written by a number of people. Mark Keenum has had a chapter, Chief Justice of Rhode Island, retired Frank Williams, 2 Grant editors, David Nolan and Louis Gallo, and myself, the executive director. We wrote this book, which every freshman now will be getting and will be discussing over the year. And the thing that we tried to do, you can see it's a thin book. Knowing what students are like, we wanted something thin so they might actually read it. That's important. But in any case, readers will read this particular book, and they'll learn about Grant the man and not just Grant the myth. They'll have a chance to read about Grant's friendship with Lincoln. And really, most significantly, I think, the connection between the Grant family and the family of the first MSU president, Confederate General Stephen D. Lee. And I think they also learned something important for freshmen to learn from Grant's life. And we hope, too, that this will inspire them to make more frequent visits to the Grant Presidential Library to learn even more Fortunately, the University Press of Mississippi, which is the publisher of this book, has made the book available for purchase to the general public. And the story of Grant and his fascinating connections to Abraham Lincoln and this Confederate general, Stephen D. Lee, makes Grant become even more well-known than he already is. Thank you.
Shelby?
So Jim, along with probably many of you, will take comfort in the fact that my book contains no mathematics at all, even though that's what I teach. Even though I do have an article coming out in January, historical article, where I do cite the law of science, so I do kind of intermingle math and history in that article, but not in my book. My book is Behind the Rifle, Women Soldiers in Civil War in Mississippi. It is the first book dealing with women soldiers with a regional focus. There's not a lot out there, and actually my book is the first one to deal with the regional focus, specifically Mississippi. But even though the focus is Mississippi, I do branch out and talk about women soldiers who fought in Gettysburg, for example. I'll talk about women soldiers who were confined in Andersonville prison. So it's not all about Mississippi, but of course that is my focus. So it's basically a chronology of Mississippi's involvement in the Civil War as told through the stories of the women who fought there, which is still a relatively new topic. Again, you know, there's not a whole lot out there, but I did find women who fought in every battle in Mississippi except for maybe Tupelo. But interestingly enough, women weren't allowed to serve as soldiers in the Civil War 150 years ago, so they had to be sneaky about it. But there was one woman who claimed ignorance, though. When she was caught, she said that nobody specified that women couldn't fight. So, you know, there she was, but she was discovered, and which she kind of told on herself because she was disguised as a man, so obviously she had to know she couldn't be there, but she tried anyway. But yes, like this woman, women had to disguise themselves as men in order to serve in the Civil War, which of course makes my job much more difficult because I have to find out who they really were and, you know, their true names, which a lot of them had multiple feminine names and multiple male aliases they had to enlist under. So it's kind of like I had to be a detective to find out all of this. But something interesting of note is there were at least 2 women whose brigades faced off against each other at Champion Hill, which of course is a major battle of the Vicksburg campaign. So, you know, in my mind, I think probably they should have just let the women take care of it anyway, right? I mean, the war would have ended very quickly, or would still be going on today if they'd have just let the women fight. But that's basically it. There's still, you know, a lot. I'm still researching them, finding out new information every day. It's a lot of new information in my book, so I hope that you'll enjoy it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and I'm thrilled to be here. Sisters and Rebels follows 3 sisters who were born in the 1880s and 90s over the course of the 20th century and uses them and their circles of lovers, colleagues, and friends to lift up the struggle of white Southerners to come to grips with the legacy of slavery, secession, and segregation. In short, full disclosure, it's not about the Civil War, but the Civil War casts a long shadow on the sisters' lives, just as it casts its shadow on the present day. So for that reason, I start the book not with the births of the sisters, but on their father's plantation in Georgia, where he was raised until he marched off to fight in the war at the age of 15. And it compares the realities of his life with the stories he told his daughters. And a key chapter of the book, maybe the key chapter of the book, is about the late 19th century struggle of white Southerners to win the battle for historical memory. That is, to define how the country was going to remember slavery and the Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War, the struggle for what they called the lost, the movement was to commemorate what they called the lost cause. William Lumpkin, the father of these three sisters, had been a obscure private in the actual war, but he made his name as a colonel in the United Confederate Veterans, and he devoted his life to this project. And most important for my story, he also inculcated his three daughters with his devotion to the cause. He trained them in what was then the male identified art of oratory, and deployed them around the South as girl orators at veterans' reunions. Well, needless to say, this upbringing had a profound impact on their lives, and each of the sisters grappled with the legacy of that upbringing in a different way. Elizabeth, the oldest, was pushed at the boundaries of womanhood in her own way, but she did not stray very far from her father's teachings. But Catherine and Grace lived what I think were fascinatingly unconventional lives. And key to those lives, to that process of self-reinvention and self-liberation, was a confrontation with the question that lies at the heart of the debates that we're having today over the meaning of Confederate monuments and the nature of the lost cause. I often think about, wonder what Catherine, the youngest and is sort of the moral compass of my book, would say if she were alive today and participating in those debates. So I thought I would end with just reading you one sentence of what she said about her own participation in that lost cause movement as a child. She says, no lesson of our history was taught us earlier, and none with greater urgency than the either-or terms in which this was couched. Soldiers might perish, slavery might end, mansions might crumble, but as long as whites retained their dominance over blacks, the South's cause would not be lost. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to throw out a couple of questions, and want to begin with a quote from your book, actually. As a wonderful quote from Catherine, one of the sisters, where she said, to her sorrow, she had learned that when people read books, very often they read what they wish to see, not what the author means at all. Read into it their feelings, their sentiments, their outlooks, and they kind of leave the poor author out in the cold. So I'd like to ask each of you, and I'll begin with you if that's all right, what did you wish to impart to the people who read your book, if you can have a main theme, and also, what do you hope they don't take away from the book?
Oh, wow, what a good question. Can I just say quickly what she meant?
Absolutely.
Mainly what she meant is that she writes, just as I write in some detail about the period before she was born, about the antebellum period, her parents, her grandparents, she tried to write about them in that period in a way that really conveyed how she understood it when she was a child. And and then she goes on to talk about how she came to understand it as she grew older. But the book was very, very well received in the South as well as in the North, published in 1946. But there were readers who thought that she was a member of the Moonlight and Magnolia School, that she was an apologist for slavery, an apologist for the South's point of view in the Civil War and so on, because she was trying to convey how she saw it as a child. As for me, gosh, there's so many, this is such a complicated book with so many different themes. And I guess one thing that I hope that readers take away is that, on the one hand, I really am interested in trying to understand these particular women and what motivated them and so on. But even more important to me is to try to understand the times that they were part of, the movements that they were part of, and the generation that they were part of. So I hope that readers don't come away concentrating only on the personal stories.
Anyone else?
Well, I can tell you about this book that we did about Hold On with a Bulldog Grip. There's several aims, and actually the great idea for this book came from the president, Mark Keenum, who's a big Civil War buff, and he likes the Civil War, likes to read about the Civil War, and so he was very supportive of the Grant Presidential Library being in Mississippi State, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems to me that what we're trying to do in this book is maybe two things. That to try to show Grant as a person, not as somebody on a statue or a pedestal someplace, but a real live, breathing human being. And we also would like the people who read the book to come to better understand that answer to that question that I mentioned earlier. How is it possible that Grant's in Mississippi, in the heart of the old Confederacy? So we try in this book to really present the facts, not to present the mythology, not to try to convince anybody of anything, but simply present what the situation really was and what we are trying to do. And what we hope does not happen is we hope that some of the myths about Grant are not reinforced by something that we might have written in this particular book. Just one example to show that Grant was indeed a human being. If you read his letters to his wife and his family, he always seems to end the letters to his wife with something like, "Love and kisses to the children, and to you, my beloved wife." That's not something that you normally think of Grant doing. And secondly, we hope that when people read this book, they don't get the idea that some of the mythology that's associated with Grant, particularly in Mississippi, is not reinforced.
What I'd like people to take away from my book is an appreciation of the enormous amount of sacrifice involved with these women soldiers, because as I mentioned a while ago, they had to be sneaky when they enlisted. They had to assume a male identity. So first of all, they've lost their names, and in most cases, they lost their names to history because these women, when they died, nobody knew who they truly were. They knew, in most cases, what their male alias was, but nobody knew who they really were. And there were bodies of female soldiers being exhumed years after the war that nobody knew who they were. So again, they lost who they were. They lost their identities. And in some cases, they lost their lives in very gruesome ways. I talk about a woman soldier from North Carolina who was found after the Battle of Allatoona in October '64, had her face beaten away. So they endured the same physical demands that the male soldiers did. They suffered like the male soldiers did. And so I want people to understand the enormous amount of sacrifice involved. And they did so for a lot of the same reasons the men did. And I guess what I don't want people to take away from the book is the fact that they were not feminists. That is not why they enlisted. They were not activists. Even though activists in the future after the war, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, pointed to their successes and their endeavors as evidence that the women could be successful outside the home and could vote and could become productive members of society. So these women were precursors of our women in the military today. You know, it was it 2015 that that military roles were opened up to women, all military roles, but they were fighting and dying on battlefields, 150 years ago. So that's what I would like people to take away.
Thank you. Thank you.
One takeaway that some people might have from my book could be just the general volatility of politics before the Civil War. Today, what do you hear? We're more divided than we've ever been, right? Everybody's divided. All these bad things are happening. Well, I think we probably have been more divided in past eras, or at least as divided as we might be today. On the floor of the U.S. Senate, you have Henry Foote pulling a gun on another senator. Okay, I haven't seen that happen. Okay, he pulled a knife on another senator. They're on the floor of the U.S. Senate. He hadn't gotten in these brawls rolling around on the floor of the U.S. Senate. These guys back then, prior to the Civil War, that era, they were a very violent crew, or could be. Foote wasn't the only one that sort of acted out like that. But if Foote were around today, you'd see film clips of him. Talk about C-SPAN. He could provide material for C-SPAN forever, and you would see it for the rest of your life. So one takeaway from my book might be that just the divided, the divisions within the politics, the body politic that you had back then. It was very serious. It was very violent, and not just the people in general, but the representatives in Congress were a pretty rowdy group. And also, I would say Henry Foote, if you read about his life, he had an alternate point of view with regard to the issue of secession. Usually you talk about Mississippi and secession. There's a list of names, people that were behind that secession movement before the Civil War. You got a lot of counties in Mississippi named for those guys. And you don't really hear about the people that preached cooperation with the North, at least for a while. The people that weren't hot on the whole secession movement. And hopefully, people could read about that and understand that there were other people out there that had alternate views on some of these political issues.
Thank you. In writing history, particularly people who have done biographies, obviously you get very well acquainted with the people that are the subjects of your book. And in your case, you actually talked to two of the sisters, if I recall. And John, you may have known U.S. Grant, I'm not sure. But there are all, as much research as we are able to do, there are always things that you don't ever know about a person, things that remain unknown, maybe unknowable. I was going to ask each of you if there's something, and Shelby, I know there are quite a number of things in your book, probably, but things that that you would really like to know that you never were able to have been able to find out. We'll start with you, Shelby. How about that?
How about every woman I wrote about? I mean, their names, like I said, you know, they gave up who they were to serve for their various causes. And so we don't know who they were. So I would like to know their real names. In a lot of cases, you know, what happened to them after the war, because in a lot of the stories that I write about, we see them pop up, they were discovered, they were killed, whatever, and then they just kind of fall off the face of the earth. Their story just kind of ends. And so I was fortunate I was able to conclude some of the stories for some of the women, but a lot of them just simply end anonymously. And so you know, hopefully there are some letters or diaries out there that remain undiscovered that maybe they'll come to light and we can add some more pieces to the puzzle. But just the nature of my research, you know, these women didn't want to be discovered. They didn't want their stories to be told. So there's a lot of subterfuge involved, a lot of digging, a lot of detective work. And so for most of them, we probably won't ever know who they truly were or where they came from or ultimately what happened to them, and it drives me crazy.
Well, mine is maybe more simple or more complicated than what you've just said. What I want to do when my time comes and I pass away and I go up to the big history library up in the sky, I hope that what I can do is spend eternity sitting next to people that I've written about and just ask them one basic question: how close did I get it? Because, you know, one of the worries that I think any biographer has or any historian has is, how do we know? Imagine in your case, if somebody came along and was going to write your biography and base it just on the letters that you wrote to various people. Does that really give you, you know, a complete insight? Just the letters you wrote, nothing else. That's really mostly we have. Someone like Jackie has had the opportunity to speak to the people she's written about. Most people don't do that. Most people don't have that luxury. So I'd like to know that, and I'd also like to know. Speaking of Grant, well, what did Grant really think? Because he's a very tough nut to crack, to get inside his head. Any person is hard to get inside his head. But you have a situation, for example, here, where we have the Grant family and the Stephen D. Lee family, Confederate Union, actually get to know each other and get to like each other. The keynote speaker, for example, at Vicksburg, when the great statue of Stephen D. Lee was raised up, the keynote speaker was Fred Grant, Grant's firstborn son. And then later on, Blewett Lee, who was the child of Stephen D. Lee, went up to Galena and gave a lecture or a talk about Grant in what was considered Grant's hometown. And you wonder how much of this is accurate, how much of this can you base your, so there's a lot of things I think you just don't know. We'll never know, I think.
I would echo that too. When I was doing research on Henry Foote, many times I thought to myself, I just wish I could talk to him about this for about 5 minutes and get the straight scoop. Because Henry Foote, one problem I had, he did not leave any papers, or not a lot of papers. But luckily, he was so reviled by some people that other people wrote a lot about him. And he's quoted in the newspapers. He was also, luckily, he was a blowhard who just was friends with all the reporters, and they quoted him in the newspapers just all over the country. He was quoted. So there was more than enough to sort of get a feel about what he was all about. But yeah, you never really know even reading the quotes in the paper, you don't get the emotion that he was putting into those, may or may not have been putting into those quotes. Reading something's never going to be as, beneficial as talking to the person, obviously, face to face. So yeah, I wish I could talk to this guy for just a couple of minutes and get a couple of things straight. That would be what I take away from that.
Thank you.
Well, not knowing and the mystery of the human heart is at the center of this book. And one of the things that I try to do in it, and that I hope readers will notice and enjoy or appreciate, is that I try to bring readers into my own detective journey, into my own effort to understand and to know and to be upfront about what I cannot know. I did interview two of these sisters at the very, very beginning when I was still a graduate student, and I had just moved to Chapel Hill to start this oral history program, and they were among the first two people that I interviewed. And these interviews were invaluable. I came back to them over and over once I decided to write this book many years later. But one of the things that was fascinating about the interviews was all the things that they didn't want to talk about. And when I began to do research on this book, I discovered that there were parts of their lives that they had just eliminated from the historical record by burning their papers, by laundering their papers, and by continuing to either refuse to or to talk, depending on the sister, to talk about certain aspects of the past in an honest way. So I try to fill in those gaps by turning over every possible rock of evidence that I can, but in the end, there's still certain mysteries that I can't know from the inside. I mean, just as my fellow panelists said, I can now know a lot about what they did and what they wrote and who they were involved with and so on. But because I have so few personal letters, in many cases, I'm trying to, like a fiction writer, imagine my way into how they felt about these things.
Thank you. We'd like to invite any of you that might have questions for our panelists to come to the microphone at this time and ask them something. And if we're not, I'll continue to ask a few questions, but feel free to come on up. I'd like to ask each of you, if you could, to in the subject area that you've written about, and I know your book is the best one in that area, but are there other books related to the topic that you would recommend that people might explore?
Yes. I actually, I mean, first of all, I'd like for people to read Catherine's autobiography, which I love and think is a classic. It was the first, really, example of what has become an important genre of Southern writing, in which white Southerners tried to write about their own involvement in the South's caste system, their own, and how they liberated themselves from the views that they were taught as children. Another autobiography that I would recommend is by Virginia Durr, called Outside the Magic Circle, she was a little younger but a contemporary of these women. And it gives a wonderful view of these anti-racist white Southerners that I'm trying to write about here. There's also literature in women's history that is growing, that is, I mean, I was talking to a friend here about how when we're putting panels together, we have the Civil War and then we have the Civil Rights Movement. And there was a whole lot of history in between those two things, which is where my book falls, the period of the era of Jim Crow, the era of the Cold War and McCarthyism. And this is also the era between the women's suffrage movement, which we're celebrating the anniversary of this year, and the women's liberation movement of the 60s and 70s. Well, these women fall in between those two things, too. And they wouldn't have called themselves feminists, but they were feminists, a certain strand. They represented a certain strand of feminism, a certain period of feminism that really complicates our understanding of what feminism is. So I won't try to name all of those books, but it's a growing literature that I would recommend keeping your eye out for.
And in case they're interested, what's the name of Catherine's autobiography?
Oh, The Making of a Southerner. Thank you.
I was going to say a couple of things. There's been a real renaissance in grant studies in the last several years. We like to think it's because of John Y. Simon, who was the former executive director of the Grant Association, and he published since 1967, 31 volumes of Grant's writings, which are never available. We finished that situation out, and yet that only represents about 20% of the material on Grant and others that we have at Mississippi State. But there have been several really good books. Ron Chernow, who many of you know, who's more famous for his books and his Broadway play on Hamilton, but his book is wonderful. Ron White at the Huntington Library has done a terrific job, and I'm hoping I don't leave anybody out. But Joan Waugh at UCLA has written a wonderful short book. It's just really very, very well done. And Chuck Calhoun, who's retired from a university in North Carolina, did a book on Grant's presidency, which revolutionizes, again, Grant studies, I would think. And we like to think, too, that what we've done at Mississippi State is we've published a number of books on Grant, including the first completely annotated memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. Harvard University Press published it for us, and I think I got an opening to the door here if I have to, but we're also working on the memoirs of William T. Sherman, too. So we're getting that done, so don't hold that against me. But Southern Illinois University Press has also started a series called The World of Ulysses S. Grant, and we have some really major historians writing some excellent books on Grant. And what they're all basically saying is the old mythology doesn't hold water. It's just not accurate. So what you want to do is you want to read the book. I tell people if you're going to read one book, and I love all these books, but the shortest one is the one by Joan Waugh, and it's wonderful because she deals with memory, as Jackie mentioned, and she also talks about his life. So it's really quite good, but you can't miss with Ron Chernow or Ron White or any of the other ones.
Thank you.
The seminal work on women soldiers of the Civil Wars is Deanne Blanton and Lauren Cook's They Fought Like Demons, which came out in 2002. So it's over 15 years old. I've been able to update a lot of their research. And I think in my book, I actually include 20 brand new accounts that have never been published before. So, but that's the seminal work as far as women soldiers in general. Before that, in the 1990s, Lauren Cook published An Uncommon Soldier, which was letters written by Sarah Rosetta Wakeman, 153rd New York Infantry. She died of disease in 1864 and is buried in Chalmette National Cemetery. So if you're ever down that way, you can visit Lyons Wakeman, who's actually Sarah Rosetta Wakeman. But so Rosetta was one of only a handful of women who wrote letters during the war. So again, they didn't want their stories to get out, because if they were discovered, they were shamed, they were ostracized, and their families were shamed and ostracized. So it's very little from them out there. They didn't want it to be. So I had to rely, and other people who've researched this topic have had to rely on accounts from male soldiers, letters and diaries, and thank goodness so much material is being digitized now. So many newspapers are being digitized now, so we have a lot more at our fingertips, and as do other people in other areas. But so those are the two main ones. I am working on another book on women soldiers in general, which that's years down the road. So like I said, not a whole lot out there, but They Fought Like Demons is probably the work right now anyway.
Well, luckily for me, there was no biography of Henry Foote in existence. A couple of articles were written about him back in the 1960s, early 1970s, and that's one reason I chose him also for a topic. Nobody had written on him before. And I was kind of surprised because, again, he was involved in so much of the politics leading up to the Civil War, and even a little bit after the Civil War. But his central rivalry in his whole career, like I mentioned before, was Jefferson Davis was his chief rival, and he was Davis's most outspoken critic. And the hatred between the two men, we're talking Andrew Jackson, John C. Calhoun, we're talking LBJ, Robert Kennedy. I mean, the hatred was strong. And I might suggest, if you want to, 4 or 5 books, good ones on biographies of Jefferson Davis, a lot more than that, actually. But if you want to read maybe some of those and see how Foote is treated by the individuals who wrote the Davis biographies, and then contrast them, then everyone get my book and contrast them on, kind of the compare notes there. It is kind of interesting to see how Foote is treated by some of Davis's biographers.
We had a question and you left. If you'd like to come back, we'll be glad to entertain it. Oh.
The gentleman before.
Yes, ma'am.
The gentleman before said you already answered his question. We're always taught to learn from history so we won't repeat it again. And so I was just wondering, and this is for anybody on the panel, is there any one thing that you want us to pick up from your book that says, read this, learn from it, and don't do it again? Anybody?
I can speak to that. The two younger sisters that I write about, Catherine and Grace, lived through the McCarthy era, reacted to it in very different ways, but in both cases, their lives were derailed by the anti-communist hysteria of that and repression of that period. So I would certainly say don't do that again.
I agree.
Anyone else?
Everybody always says read your history so you won't repeat your mistakes, but we keep repeating them over and over again. That's my only comment.
Yes, sir.
I'm not a fan of that period, but I do read a lot of nonfiction and read a lot of history. But I'm not, very familiar with the Civil War period. And it may be something called some kind of social memory or something like that. Some of the psychologists of the modern era said that war was psychosis. And I'm thinking, I guess, about the Freudians, but and I never have been able to understand why the war went on so long. Was it because the commanders or the president wanted unconditional surrender? Because we were taught that, the deal was over after Vicksburg. And then it went on 2 years.
Well, who wants to jump into that? How long do we have?
How long do we?
I think there are a host of reasons the war continued. And a lot of it had to do, I think, with the willingness of these people to continue to fight.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Well, I have a statement and a question. And the statement's for Dr. Marzalak. I know that you're working really hard at Mississippi
Speak
State.
louder, I don't hear very well.
I know that you're trying to work very hard at Mississippi State to reconstruct the image of Ulysses Grant. But I just want you to know my great-grandfather on my mother's side of the family surrendered to Grant at Vicksburg, promised, he lied to U.S. Grant. He said, I'll never take up arms against the Union again. And he proceeded to go to Alabama and join up with a different outfit. So anyway, that's my statement.
But I was going to say that one of the interesting things is that Grant is the only commander on either side to have 3 armies completely surrendered to him, and in many cases they would just, they'd go home. The Vicksburg situation is particularly interesting. In fact, Joan Waugh is working on a book right now dealing with this, trying to break that nut. What was it about Grant that he was able to get other armies to absolutely surrender, and that's just quit and go away? So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, as you suggest, he had a bulldog grip.
That could be. I mean, the big thing about Grant that most historians are looking at, if you look at the Civil War as a whole, without getting in, because my moderator will correct me, but if you look at the Civil War as a whole, most of the generals came out of what we call the school of Antoine-Henri Jomini, that what you did as a general, you maneuvered your troops so you had masses of your troops against fractions of the enemy. And Grant came along, and Lincoln really did too, and said, the best thing we can do is end this war as quickly as possible, and the way we can end this war is by applying all of our numbers, all of our forces, all at the same time, rather than maneuvering, et cetera, because every time you maneuver, this gives the other side a chance to maneuver too, and pretty soon your troops and their troops are equal again, even though you have a larger number.
And of course, Lee almost always outmaneuvered Grant, as we know. That's my observation. But I'd like to ask Dr. Wynn a question. You mentioned something about secession, and you seem to make a distinction between the secessionist movement and the institution of slavery earlier in this session. Can you clarify that, or did I just totally miss it?
Well, they're both all intertwined. It's all intertwined, of course.
I'm sorry?
I said it's all intertwined. By the secession movement, I mean the actual political act of seceding, the southern states claiming they were seceding from the Union in a political sense. Now, secession was the product of the fact that one section of the country had slavery and the other one didn't. So the southern states seceded to defend that institution. But when I was talking about there's a difference there, I'm talking about the actual political act of secession. That makes sense?
I think so, yeah.
And Foote was both pro-slavery and anti-secession.
He was extremely pro-slavery. Yeah, he's that's what made him such a strange character. Yeah, but he was a pro-slavery ideologue. Yeah, I don't want that to get lost.
This is what's so interesting, I think, about what makes the Civil War so interesting, I think, is that you have a situation where there are people who say, no, we shouldn't break the country apart, this is the great democracy, et cetera. And then you have others who say, whatever we do, we got to make sure that slavery is not disturbed. And that's a fascinating thing to really try to get into people's heads. But you have, for example, a lot of the border states. They were more opposed to this political act of secession than they were about the whole question of slavery.
We've got just a moment for a question.
One more
If you could make it
quick
brief.
question for Dr. Marzalek. As one of his former students, I went on to read his book on Sherman, and my daughter gave me a new copy of his memoirs. And I've been reading those, and I noticed early in his life, when he was in the Mexican War, he can almost remember to the day when a certain conflict took place, certain campaign, and then goes all the way up to Shiloh, and he's saying exactly what date so-and-so conflict arose. How could he remember that? Did he take notes along the way? Grant, taking notes? It's amazing. What do you discover after going through that and annotating? Now, there were some annotations where corrections were made by about one day.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because both Grant and Sherman, the big problem with Sherman is he never stops talking. I mean, he just goes on and on, mentions everybody who participated in this battle and that thing, et cetera. Grant speaks more than the mythology is, but he also makes it possible to write that, to create a memoirs that is cleaner, that is easier. One of the biggest problems we had with the Grant memoirs had to do with Mississippi. That doggone river kept changing and cutting up these little towns that used to exist. And Grant would talk in 1885, would talk about some town in Mississippi along the river. Nobody in modern time would know what that is. And that's what we tried to do, try to make it more open to modern reason. Give you another example of how things have changed in the study, really, of the Civil War. One of the big issues that publishers deal with now is putting footnotes at the back of the book. So you're reading here and you got to flip over. You're reading here and you got to flip over. Well, one of the things we did, we insisted that they be real footnotes. So you're reading along and you could drop down. That took some time to get that accomplished. But the two men, you know, Sherman and Grant, are completely different people. And what I like to point out is if they walked in here, those two guys were reborn and walked in here, two things would happen. Sherman would start slapping people on the back, shaking hands with people. Hey, Charlie, how you doing? Grant would find some corner of the room where he wouldn't have to talk to too many people, because he just simply did not like to talk. But yet he thought a lot. But anyway, good to see you again.
You too.
Okay.
Jacksonian history class.
We have come to the end of our session. I want to thank all of our panelists for being here. Thank you all for being here.